Hey folks, today we are talking about forgotten inventions that were far ahead of their time.
Some inventions were so advanced, humanity simply wasn't ready to deserve them. 1. The picture phone, 1964. In 1964, the engineers at AT&T unveiled something that looks like it had fallen straight out of a science fiction movie, the picture phone. This wasn't just a telephone. It was a device that let people see each other while talking, decades before Zoom, FaceTime, or awkward work meetings where nobody knows how to mute their microphone. The company proudly demonstrated it at the New York World's Fair. Visitors stared at the screen in amazement as a person in another city appeared live, speaking back to them. It was revolutionary. The future had officially arrived. There was just one tiny problem. Nobody wanted it. The picture phone was expensive, bulky, and required special lines installed in your home. Calls cost a small fortune, and the idea of being seen while talking on the phone made many people deeply uncomfortable. Americans had spent decades enjoying the luxury of talking in pajamas, with messy hair, maybe eating cereal straight from the box. Now AT&T wanted them to look presentable? The public voted with their wallets. The picture phone quietly disappeared, only for the exact same idea to return 40 years later as FaceTime, Zoom, and every video call you secretly hope gets canceled. 2. The Dynasphere, the one-wheel car, 1930s. In the 1930s, a British engineer named Dr. J.A. Purves decided the traditional car had one fatal flaw: too many wheels. So he built something called the Dynasphere, a vehicle that looks like a hamster ball designed by an overconfident mad scientist. Instead of four wheels, the entire car was one giant wheel with the driver sitting inside the center. When the engine powered the rim, the entire sphere rolled forward. From the outside, it looked like a futuristic transportation device from a retro sci-fi comic. From the inside, it felt like riding inside a rotating washing machine. On paper, the Dynasphere had advantages: fewer moving parts, potentially faster speeds, and technically, it could roll over obstacles that would stop normal cars. But there was a problem engineers politely call practical reality. Turning was difficult. Braking could cause the driver compartment to swing like a pendulum. And if you hit a bump too fast, you basically performed an involuntary somersault inside your own vehicle. The Dynasphere never became the future of transportation. But somewhere, a hamster looked at it and thought, finally, a vehicle designed by someone who understands me. 3. Nikola Tesla's wireless power tower, 1901. At the beginning of the 20th century, inventor Nikola Tesla had an idea that sounded almost magical. What if electricity didn't need wires at all? Tesla believed he could transmit electrical power through the air using massive towers that sent energy across the Earth's atmosphere. His most ambitious experiment was the Wardenclyffe Tower, built in New York in 1901. The plan was astonishingly bold. Tesla imagined a world where giant transmission towers would broadcast electricity across continents. Homes could receive power without cables. Ships could recharge in the middle of the ocean. Entire cities might run on energy pulled straight from the air. In other words, Tesla wanted to invent global wireless electricity more than a century ago. Unfortunately, investors looked at the project and asked the most dangerous question in business: how do we charge people for something that's free in the air? Funding vanished. Construction stopped. The tower was eventually demolished. Today we charge phones wirelessly, power devices without plugs, and dream about wireless energy again. Which means Tesla might have been right. Humanity just needed another 100 years to catch up. 4. The mechanical television, 1920s. Long before sleek, flat-screen TVs hung on living room walls, the very first television system looked like something assembled in a garage by a very ambitious clockmaker. In the 1920s, Scottish inventor John Logie Baird created what was known as the mechanical television. Instead of using electronic displays like modern TVs, his system relied on spinning metal discs with tiny holes cut into them. As the disc rotated at high speed, it scanned images line by line and reconstructed them on another spinning disc connected to a screen. It technically worked. In fact, by 1926, Baird successfully demonstrated live television transmission. A human face appeared on a screen across the room. For the first time in history, moving images were transmitted through the air. But the experience was, let's call it, early beta. The image was tiny, blurry, orange-tinted, and flickered like a haunted lantern. The resolution was so low that recognizing a person required either optimism or excellent imagination. Soon, electronic television systems replaced Baird's spinning contraption completely. Still, his invention proved something remarkable. The idea of television wasn't crazy. It just needed better technology than a glorified spinning pizza cutter. 5. The gas-powered roller skates, 1960s. Every generation tries to reinvent transportation. Some create electric cars, others create bullet trains. And then there was the man who invented gas-powered roller skates. In the 1960s, an inventor named M.L. Johnson decided that walking was inefficient and bicycles were simply too reasonable. His solution was a pair of roller skates equipped with tiny gasoline engines strapped directly to the rider's feet. Yes, engines, on your shoes. The skates used miniature motors that powered the wheels and pushed the rider forward at speeds that were frankly terrifying for something attached to your ankles. In demonstrations, riders zoomed down streets like human-sized fireworks with very questionable braking systems. Steering required leaning, balance, and a healthy acceptance of potential hospital visits. The idea sounded futuristic, personal transportation that was small, portable, and fast. The problem? Most people prefer their transportation not exploding inches from their feet. Between the noise, fuel smell, safety concerns, and the very real possibility of turning your commute into a stunt show, gas-powered skates never caught on. Still, the concept was decades ahead of modern electric mobility devices like hoverboards and e-skates. The difference is, today's versions don't smell like a lawnmower. 6. The 1930s video phone booth. Today, if you want to make a video call, you open an app, tap a button, and instantly appear on someone's screen. But the idea actually existed almost a century ago. In the 1930s, engineers in Germany created one of the first public video phone systems. Special booths were installed in post offices where people could walk in, sit down, and make a video call to another city. Imagine a phone booth, except instead of just a handset, it had a screen, camera, and lighting. For the time, it felt like science fiction. You could sit in Berlin and see the face of someone in Leipzig while talking to them in real time. But again, reality ruined the dream. The equipment was extremely expensive, the network infrastructure was complicated, and calls required both users to be physically present inside special government-run booths. In other words, the technology was amazing. The logistics were a nightmare. Eventually, the system faded away, mostly remembered as a technological curiosity. Nearly 80 years later, we reinvented the same idea. Except now, the booth fits inside your pocket and occasionally freezes during important meetings. Progress. 7. The airplane that could land anywhere, the autogyro, 1920s. Before helicopters dominated vertical flight, engineers experimented with a strange flying machine called the autogyro. Invented in the 1920s by Spanish engineer Juan de la Cierva, the autogyro looked like a hybrid between a small airplane and a helicopter. It had a spinning rotor on top like a helicopter, but instead of being powered directly by the engine, the rotor spun freely as air passed through it. The engine drove a traditional propeller that pulled the aircraft forward. This design gave the autogyro a remarkable advantage. It could take off and land in incredibly short distances. In some cases, it needed only a tiny field instead of a full runway. For early aviation, this was revolutionary. Imagine aircraft landing in city streets, farms, or remote areas where airports didn't exist. The autogyro became popular for a short time in the 1930s and even appeared in newsreels and experimental transportation projects. But then, helicopters improved. Once engineers figured out how to power the rotor directly and hover in place, the autogyro suddenly looked like the awkward cousin of a better machine. Still, it paved the way for modern rotorcraft. Without the autogyro, helicopters might have taken much longer to exist. 8. The 1860 steam car that was too early. When people think about early cars, they usually imagine gasoline engines from the early 1900s. But decades before Henry Ford made cars famous, inventors were already experimenting with steam-powered automobiles. One of the earliest was built around 1860 by Belgian engineer Etienne Lenoir, who created a self-propelled vehicle powered by a primitive internal combustion engine. Other inventors experimented with steam engines mounted onto carriage frames, creating what were essentially horseless carriages powered by boiling water. The idea was brilliant. Instead of horses, a machine could move people across long distances. But the world wasn't ready. Roads were terrible. Fuel infrastructure barely existed. Steam vehicles required large boilers that needed time to heat up before moving. And the machines were complicated enough to intimidate anyone who wasn't an engineer. So the idea stalled. Decades later, when engines became smaller and roads improved, the automobile revolution finally happened. In other words, the first cars didn't fail because they were bad ideas. They failed because they showed up about 40 years too early. 9. The personal flying platform, 1950s. In the 1950s, the US military became obsessed with a question that sounded like it came straight from a comic book. What if soldiers could fly without airplanes? Engineers at Hiller Aviation built something called the flying platform, officially known as the VZ-1 Pawnee. It looked less like an aircraft and more like a giant circular fan with a man standing on top of it like he was about to mow the sky. The concept was simple. Powerful rotors pushed air downward, creating lift. The pilot balanced on the platform and controlled movement by leaning in different directions. In theory, it was genius. A soldier could hover above the battlefield, move quickly over obstacles, and land almost anywhere. No runway, no helicopter training, just step on and go. In practice, however, balancing on a flying dinner plate turned out to be slightly terrifying. Wind gusts could throw the platform off balance, and controlling it required the kind of stability normally found only in professional surfers or circus performers. The military eventually decided helicopters were a safer bet. But for a brief moment in history, engineers genuinely believed the future of transportation involved standing on top of a flying fan. 10. The 1960s Internet before the Internet, ARPANET. Today, the Internet feels like it has always existed. But the idea of a global digital network actually began in the late 1960s with a project called ARPANET, funded by the US Department of Defense. The goal wasn't social media, streaming movies, or arguing with strangers online. It was far more serious. Scientists wanted a communication network that could survive even if parts of it were destroyed. Instead of sending information through one central system, data would travel in small packets across many different routes. In 1969, the first message was sent between two computers at universities in California. The message was supposed to be the word Logan. Instead, the system crashed after the first two letters. So the first message in Internet history was simply LO, which is either a technical failure or the universe politely saying hello. At the time, only a handful of researchers used the system. Nobody imagined billions of people would one day use the same concept to watch cat videos, argue about pizza toppings, and accidentally join meetings with their microphones on. ARPANET was decades ahead of its time. It built the blueprint for the digital world long before most people even owned a computer. 11. The 19th century electric car, 1830s to 1890s. When people talk about electric vehicles today, it sounds like the newest breakthrough in transportation. But electric cars are actually older than gasoline cars. In the 1800s, inventors in Europe and America built some of the first electric-powered vehicles. By the late 19th century, electric taxis were operating in cities like New York and London. These vehicles were quiet, smooth, and far easier to operate than gasoline cars, which required hand cranking and mechanical knowledge just to start. In fact, around 1900, electric cars were considered luxury technology. They didn't smell like gasoline, they didn't vibrate violently, and they didn't require drivers to wrestle with complicated engines. So why didn't electric cars dominate the world? Range. Early batteries could only travel short distances, and charging infrastructure barely existed. Meanwhile, gasoline engines improved rapidly, and Henry Ford's assembly line made gas-powered cars cheaper than anything else. Electric cars faded into history. More than a century later, companies like Tesla brought the idea back, which means the future of transportation is actually just the return of a 19th century idea that finally got better batteries. 12. The early tablet computer, 1968. In 1968, computer scientist Alan Kay imagined something that sounded impossible at the time, a portable computer the size of a notebook. He called the idea the Dynabook, a thin electronic device with a screen that people could carry anywhere, used for reading, writing, learning, and communication. Sound familiar? The Dynabook concept included many things we associate with modern tablets: touchscreen interaction, digital books, personal computing for children, and portable learning tools. There was only one issue. The The technology to build it didn't exist yet. Computers in the 1960s were enormous machines that filled entire rooms and required teams of technicians to operate them. The idea of shrinking that power into something you could hold in your hands sounded almost ridiculous. But Kay kept developing the concept because he believed computing would eventually become personal and portable. Decades later, tablets like the iPad appeared, almost exactly matching the vision he described. The Dynabook wasn't a product, it was a prediction. And sometimes the most powerful inventions start as ideas that simply arrive 50 years too early. 13. The smart home. From the 1970s. Today, smart homes control lights, thermostats, and security systems with voice commands. But the idea actually began in the 1970s when engineers created one of the first home automation systems called X10. The system allowed electrical devices in a house to communicate through existing power lines. With special controllers, homeowners could remotely turn lights on or off, set timers, and automate appliances. For the time, it felt futuristic. Imagine sitting on your couch and controlling lights in another room without walking over to the switch. That was practically science fiction. But early smart homes had a few technical personality issues. Signals sometimes interfered with each other. Appliances randomly turned on or off, and programming the system required the patience of someone assembling a spaceship. As a result, only hobbyists and tech enthusiasts used it. The mainstream public ignored it completely. Today, however, the same concept powers Alexa, Google Home, and smart lighting systems everywhere. The difference is, modern smart homes rarely turn on your toaster at 3 a.m. just to prove they can. 14. The first virtual reality machine, 1962. Long before VR headsets and virtual worlds, a filmmaker named Morton Heilig built something astonishing. In 1962, he created a machine called the Sensorama. It looked like a giant arcade cabinet where users placed their heads into a viewing window. Inside, the machine displayed 3D film footage while also producing wind, vibrations, and even smells. Yes, smells. If the scene showed a motorcycle ride through a city, the machine would vibrate, blow air in your face, and release scents matching the environment. The goal was to create total immersion. Today we call that virtual reality. But in the 1960s, the technology was too expensive and complicated to produce widely. Investors didn't believe people would want such an intense sensory experience. So the Sensorama remained mostly an experimental prototype. Decades later, VR headsets became popular, and developers started chasing the same dream Heilig had. Which means the first virtual reality machine existed more than 60 years before most people tried VR-15. The early mobile phone, 1973. When people imagine early cell phones, they usually think of giant brick-sized devices from the 1980s. But the first real mobile phone call happened even earlier. In 1973, Motorola engineer Martin Cooper walked down a street in New York City carrying a device that looked like a futuristic walkie-talkie. Then he made history. Cooper called a rival engineer at Bell Labs and calmly told him he was speaking from a handheld mobile phone. The device weighed over 2 pounds, had a battery life of about 30 minutes, and required nearly 10 hours to recharge. In other words, it was not exactly convenient, but the concept was revolutionary. A phone that wasn't tied to a wall, desk, or telephone booth. The technology existed, but the world wasn't ready yet. It took another decade before mobile phones became commercially available, and several more decades before they became the tiny computers everyone carries today. Back then, the idea of billions of people carrying phones everywhere sounded ridiculous. Today, it's practically impossible to leave the house without one. 16. The smart refrigerator, 1999. At the end of the 1990s, long before smart homes became normal, engineers decided your refrigerator deserved a brain. In 1999, companies like LG and Electrolux introduced some of the first internet-connected refrigerators. These machines included touchscreens, basic internet access, and software designed to track the food inside. The idea sounded incredibly futuristic. Your fridge could remind you when milk was about to expire, help you plan grocery lists, and even suggest recipes based on what you had inside. Some prototypes could connect to online grocery services so you could reorder food automatically. In other words, the refrigerator was trying to become your kitchen assistant. But consumers looked at the price tags and laughed nervously. These early smart fridges cost thousands of dollars more than normal refrigerators, and the software was slow, clunky, and about as responsive as a sleepy dial-up connection. Most people decided they could simply open the fridge door and check if the milk was empty. Still, the concept survived. Today's smart refrigerators with touchscreens, cameras, and Wi-Fi exist in millions of homes, which proves the idea wasn't bad. It was just 20 years too early for decent internet speeds. 17. The Jetpack Dream, 1960s. For decades, science fiction promised that by the year 2000, everyone would fly around using personal jetpacks. In the 1960s, engineers actually tried to make that dream real. Bell Aerospace developed a device called the Rocket Belt, a backpack containing hydrogen peroxide fuel that produced thrust strong enough to lift a person into the air. When activated, the pilot could rise above the ground and fly forward like a human rocket. And it worked. The rocket belt was demonstrated publicly, flown by trained pilots, and even appeared in movies and events. For a moment, it seemed like humanity had finally invented the personal flying machine promised by comic books. But there was a brutal limitation: fuel. The jetpack could only stay airborne for about 20 seconds before running out. 20 seconds of flight might impress a crowd, but it's not exactly useful for commuting to work or flying to the grocery store. Engineers tried improving the design, but fuel efficiency and safety remained huge problems. So the jetpack became a symbol of futuristic technology that almost existed. We technically built it. We just never solved the part where it needs more than half a minute to be practical. 18. The pneumatic tube mail system, 1800s to 1900s. Before email, before text messages, and even before reliable telephones, cities experimented with something surprisingly futuristic: pneumatic tube networks. These systems used underground pipes where capsules containing letters or documents were shot through the city using compressed air. Think of the tubes at a bank drive-through, except stretched across an entire city. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, cities like Paris, London, and New York built extensive tube systems that could deliver messages between offices in minutes. Clerks would place documents into a metal capsule, insert it into the tube, and whoosh! The message traveled across town faster than any horse or courier. It was essentially the physical version of email. Businesses loved the speed, but the system required massive infrastructure and constant maintenance. As telephones and later electronic communication improved, the pneumatic networks slowly disappeared. But the concept wasn't wrong. It was simply a pre-digital attempt at instant communication. In other words, people were trying to invent the internet, using metal tubes and air pressure. 19. The early e-book reader, 1949. Long before Kindles and tablets filled backpacks with digital books, a Spanish teacher named Angela Ruiz Robles imagined something revolutionary. In 1949, she patented a device called the Mechanical Encyclopedia. It was designed to replace heavy school textbooks with a portable reading machine that contained interchangeable reels of text and images. Students could load different subjects into the device and read them on illuminated panels. The machine even included features like magnification, lighting adjustments, and sound components to help with learning. Essentially, it was an early vision of the electronic book reader. Ruiz Robles wanted to make education easier for children by reducing the weight of school bags and giving students interactive learning tools. But manufacturing the device required technology and funding that simply weren't available at the time. Her invention never entered mass production. Today, millions of people read books on digital devices exactly like the one she imagined, which means the concept of the e-reader existed more than 50 years before the Kindle. 20. The early drone aircraft, 1917. Today, drones film movies, deliver packages, and hover over vacation beaches capturing aerial footage. But the concept of an unmanned aircraft is more than a century old. During World War I, engineers developed one of the earliest drone prototypes called the Kettering Bug. The aircraft looked like a small airplane packed with explosives. It was designed to fly autonomously toward enemy targets using a mechanical guidance system that counted engine revolutions to determine distance. When the engine reached the programmed number of rotations, the wings detached and the bomb dropped toward the target. The technology was extremely advanced for 1917, but it was also incredibly unreliable. Navigation systems were primitive, accuracy was questionable, and early flight control technology wasn't stable enough for consistent results. The project was eventually abandoned before being used in combat. Still, the idea laid the foundation for modern drone technology. In other words, autonomous flying machines existed during World War I. They just needed another 100 years of better electronics. 21. The early online shopping system, 1979. Today, ordering products online is completely normal. But the first version of online shopping appeared long before the internet became mainstream. In 1979, British inventor Michael Aldrich created a system that connected televisions to computers through telephone lines. Using a remote control, users could browse product catalogs displayed on their TV screens. Customers could then place orders directly from home. It was essentially Amazon in the late 1970s. Businesses quickly realized the potential. Supermarkets and companies began experimenting with the system for home shopping services, especially for elderly or disabled customers who couldn't easily visit stores. But the technology was slow, expensive, and limited. Computers were rare, networks were small, and the system required specialized equipment that few households owned. So the idea never reached the mainstream public. 2 decades later, the internet exploded, and online shopping became one of the largest industries on Earth. Which means the first version of Amazon existed almost 20 years before Jeff Bezos sold his first book online. 22. The 1930s streaming music service. In the 1930s, decades before Spotify, Apple Music, or playlists for every possible mood, a company in the United States tried to create something astonishingly modern. It was called Muzak. At first glance, it looked simple. Background music delivered into offices, elevators, restaurants, and stores through telephone lines. But the concept was revolutionary for its time. Instead of playing records locally, businesses could subscribe to a continuous stream of music transmitted directly from a central source. That's right. Music streaming existed almost 90 years ago. Companies loved the idea. Muzak promised carefully designed playlists to improve worker productivity and customer mood. Supposedly, the right song at the right time could make employees work harder and shoppers spend more money. It was basically the original algorithmic playlist. The technology relied on wired distribution rather than the internet, and the selection was limited compared to modern streaming platforms. Still, the idea was shockingly ahead of its time. Long before people streamed music through smartphones, entire office buildings were already listening to centrally broadcast playlists through telephone cables. The technology may have been analog, but the concept was unmistakably modern. 23. The first touchscreen device, 1965. Touchscreens feel like one of the most modern technologies in everyday life. You tap your phone, you swipe your tablet, you pinch images on a screen like it's the most natural thing in the world. But the first touchscreen technology actually appeared in 1965. Engineer E.A. Johnson at the Royal Radar Establishment in the United Kingdom developed one of the earliest capacitive touchscreen systems. It allowed users to interact with digital displays simply by touching the surface of the screen. At the time, computers were mostly controlled using keyboards, switches, and complicated command systems. The idea of interacting directly with a display sounded futuristic. Johnson's touchscreen technology was eventually used in air traffic control systems, where operators could select and manage information directly on the screen. But the general public never saw it. Computers were still massive machines used only by governments, scientists, and large corporations. There was no consumer market for touchscreen devices yet. Decades later, smartphones and tablets turned the touchscreen into one of the most important human-computer interfaces ever created. Which means the technology behind your phone existed more than 40 years before the iPhone. 24. The 1920s video recording machine. Today, recording video is effortless. You press a button and your phone captures high-definition footage instantly. But inventors were trying to record moving images long before modern cameras existed. In the 1920s, Scottish inventor John Logie Baird experimented with early systems that could record television images onto discs. His idea was to store visual signals using mechanical recording methods, similar to how phonographs recorded sound. If successful, people could theoretically watch recorded television programs later, instead of only seeing live broadcasts. In other words, Baird was attempting to invent something similar to the VCR in the 1920s. The technology, however, was incredibly limited. Mechanical systems struggled to capture images clearly, and recording equipment was bulky and expensive. Television itself was still experimental, so the idea of recording it seemed unnecessary to most people. The project never reached widespread use, but the concept was remarkably forward-thinking. Decades later, video recorders transformed how people consumed television, eventually leading to streaming services where viewers can watch anything, anytime. Baird had imagined that future long before the technology could support it. 25. The early digital assistant, 1980s. When people talk to Siri, Alexa, or Google Assistant today, it feels like modern artificial intelligence. But the idea of a digital personal assistant goes back to the 1980s. One of the earliest attempts was a device called the Cyan Organizer, released in 1984. It looked like a small electronic notebook that could store contacts, calendars, notes, and basic programs. For its time, this device felt revolutionary. Professionals could carry important information in their pockets instead of relying on paper planners or address books. It could even run simple software to help with scheduling and organization. The Cyan Organizer quickly gained popularity among business users and technology enthusiasts. But it was still limited by early computing power. Displays were small, storage was tiny, and the interface required patience. Yet the concept was clear: a portable digital assistant that helped manage daily life. Years later, smartphones combined all those features and added voice control, internet access, and artificial intelligence. The Cyan Organizer wasn't just a gadget. It was an early glimpse of the smartphone assistant living in everyone's pocket today. 26. The early self-driving car experiment, 1986. Self-driving cars sound like one of the most futuristic ideas in transportation. But researchers were already experimenting with autonomous vehicles in the 1980s. In 1986, engineers at Carnegie Mellon University built one of the earliest robotic vehicles capable of navigating roads using cameras and computers. The system analyzed visual data from the road ahead and adjusted steering automatically. The technology was extremely primitive compared to modern AI systems, but the vehicle could successfully drive along certain routes without human control. It was one of the first demonstrations that computers might eventually be capable of driving cars. Of course, the hardware was enormous. The computer equipment filled most of the vehicle, processing speeds were painfully slow, and the system struggled in complex environments. But the experiment proved the idea was possible. Decades later, companies like Tesla, Waymo, and others are still chasing the same dream. Which means the first serious attempts at autonomous driving began almost 40 years before modern self-driving cars appeared. 27. The early social network, 1978. Today, billions of people use social media every day. But the idea of connecting people through digital profiles and messages actually started in 1978 with a system called the Bulletin Board System, or BBS. Users could connect to a computer through telephone lines using modems. Once connected, they could post messages, share files, join discussions, and communicate with other users. Sound familiar? These early systems created online communities where strangers talked about hobbies, technology, science fiction, and almost anything else. It was essentially the first social network. Of course, the experience looked very different from modern social media. There were no photos, videos, or emojis, just simple text on glowing computer screens. Connections were slow, and only a small number of people could connect to a system at the same time. But the core idea was exactly the same as today's social platforms: people meeting online, sharing ideas, and building communities through technology. Long before Facebook, Reddit, or Twitter existed, early internet users were already doing the same thing through squealing dial-up modems. The technology was primitive, the behavior was exactly the same. Which invention deserved a second chance? The future might already exist somewhere.